The frozen creek cracked beneath Clara Whitmore's boots like a gunshot splitting the January air. And in the span of a heartbeat, she plunged through the ice into water so cold it stole the scream from her lungs. Alpine, Texas wasn't supposed to freeze like this. The winter of 1884 had brought an unnatural cold front down from the north, turning the usually mild West Texas landscape into something foreign and treacherous. Clara had been taking the shortcut back to town, her arms laden with supplies from the Henderson ranch where she worked as a cook, when the deceptive white surface gave way beneath her weight. The shock of the cold water was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It wrapped around her like iron bands, squeezing the air from her chest and turning her limbs to lead. Her heavy winter coat, which had kept her warm moments before, now dragged her down like an anchor. She opened her mouth to scream but only managed to swallow icy water that burned her throat. The current, stronger than it looked from above, pulled at her skirts and spun her around until she couldn't tell which direction was up. Through the distorted light filtering through the ice, Clara could see the hole she had fallen through, but it might as well have been a mile away. Her fingers scraped uselessly against the underside of the frozen surface, finding no purchase, no weakness she could exploit. Panic clawed at her mind as her lungs began to burn with the desperate need for air. She was going to die here, 23 years old, in a creek that barely reached 6 feet deep in the summer. Ethan Vaughn had been tracking the wounded deer for the better part of an hour when he heard the crack echo across the winter landscape. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Copper, nickered nervously and tossed his head. Ethan was 26, a ranch hand who had worked his way up to foreman at the Double R Ranch just outside of Alpine. He knew the sound of breaking ice when he heard it, and he knew what it usually meant. He didn't think. He just acted. Spurring Copper forward, he raced toward the creek, his eyes scanning the white expanse for any sign of trouble. There, about 50 yards downstream, he saw the dark hole in the ice and the scattered packages that had fallen when someone went through. His heart hammered in his chest as he yanked Copper to a halt and threw himself from the saddle. "Hold!" he shouted to the horse, knowing Copper was trained well enough to stay ground-tied. Ethan ran toward the hole, his boots pounding against the ice, each step a calculated risk. He could see her now, a dark shape moving frantically beneath the frozen surface, her pale hands pressing against the ice. Without hesitation, Ethan dropped to his stomach, distributing his weight across the ice as he crawled toward the hole. The cold bit through his clothes instantly, but he ignored it. He could see her face now, distorted through the ice and water, her eyes wide with terror and her mouth open in a silent scream. She was running out of time. Ethan pulled his knife from his belt and began stabbing at the ice near where her hands pressed against it, working to create another opening, to give her a path to air. The ice was thick, resistant, and precious seconds ticked by as he hacked at it. Finally, blessedly, he broke through, creating a second hole just large enough for a head to fit through. "Here," he shouted, hoping his voice would carry through the water. "This way," Clara heard the muffled shout and saw the new light breaking through the darkness. Her vision was starting to narrow, dark spots dancing at the edges, but she forced her nearly frozen limbs to move. She pushed off the creek bed with the last of her strength, propelling herself toward that new beacon of hope. Her head broke through the surface and she gasped, dragging in air that hurt almost as much as the water had. But before she could even register the relief, strong hands grabbed her under her arms and began hauling her up onto the ice. Ethan pulled with every ounce of strength he possessed, ignoring the way the ice groaned beneath them both. He managed to get her shoulders clear, then her torso, and finally, with one last desperate heave, he dragged her completely free of the water, But they weren't safe yet. The ice beneath them was compromised, spider web cracks spreading from both holes. "Hold on to me," he commanded, his voice rough with exertion and fear. He wrapped one arm around her shaking body and began pulling them both backward, still on his stomach, distributing their weight as much as possible. Each movement was agonizingly slow, but finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the bank where the ice met frozen earth. Ethan pulled Clara onto solid ground and immediately began assessing her condition. Her lips were blue, her whole body shaking violently with shivers she couldn't control. Ice crystals were already forming in her wet hair. He knew he had minutes, not hours, to get her warm. "Can you hear me?" he asked, his hands on her shoulders trying to catch her unfocused gaze. "Stay with me now. We need to get you warm." Clara tried to respond, but her teeth were chattering so hard she couldn't form words. She managed a small nod, which Ethan took as a good sign. She was conscious and responsive. That was something. He ran back to Copper and grabbed the bedroll from behind his saddle, along with the extra blankets he always carried in winter. Within seconds, he was back at Clara's side, stripping off her sodden coat despite her weak protests. "Your clothes are going to kill you if we don't get them off," he explained, his voice firm but not unkind. He wrapped the first blanket around her, then began working on her boots. "I know it's not proper, but dying isn't proper either." Through her haze of cold, Clara understood. She tried to help with trembling fingers, but they wouldn't cooperate. Ethan worked quickly but carefully, removing the wet outer layers and wrapping her in dry blankets. He pulled off his own coat, still relatively warm from his body heat, and added it to the layers around her. "The town's too far," he said, more to himself than to her. "Old Henderson Place is closer. Can you ride?" Clara wasn't sure she could even stand, but she nodded anyway. She had to try. Ethan lifted her with surprising gentleness for such a large man, carrying her to Copper as if she weighed nothing at all. He settled her in the saddle first, then mounted behind her, pulling her back against his chest and wrapping his arms around her to keep her upright and share what body heat he could. With a click of his tongue, he urged Copper into a smooth canter toward the Henderson ranch house, leaving behind the scattered packages and the treacherous creek. The ride took less than 15 minutes, but to Clara, it felt like another eternity. She drifted in and out of awareness, held in place only by the strong arms around her and the solid warmth at her back. She was vaguely aware of a voice near her ear, talking constantly, telling her to stay awake, to hold on just a little longer. When they reached the Henderson ranch, Ethan was shouting before they even came to a complete stop. Margaret Henderson, the ranch owner's wife, came running from the house, her eyes going wide at the sight of the ice-covered woman in Ethan's arms. "Dear Lord, what happened?" Margaret demanded, but she was already moving, holding the door open wide and gesturing them inside. "Fell through the ice on Timber Creek," Ethan explained as he carried Clara into the warm interior of the house. "Need to get her warm fast." Margaret had raised 5 children on this ranch and had dealt with her share of emergencies. She took immediate charge, directing Ethan to carry Clara to the bedroom while she stoked the fire higher and put water on to heat. "You'll need to stay with her," Margaret said matter-of-factly to Ethan. "Get those wet things off her completely and wrap her in the quilts from the chest. I will heat stones for the bed and make hot broth. And Ethan, this isn't about modesty. This is about keeping her alive." Ethan's ears reddened, but he nodded. He understood the severity of the situation. He had seen men die from cold before, had watched hypothermia steal the life from strong cowboys who thought they could tough it out. In the bedroom, with the door closed, Ethan worked as quickly and respectfully as he could. keeping his eyes averted as he removed the remaining wet clothing and wrapped Clara in layer after layer of heavy quilts. He rubbed her arms and legs through the fabric, trying to stimulate circulation, trying to bring warmth back to her frozen limbs. Clara's shaking began to lessen, but Ethan wasn't sure if that was a good sign or a bad one. He had heard that sometimes, right before the end, people stopped shivering. "Don't you dare," he said fiercely, gripping her shoulders through the quilts. "You hear me? You don't get to give up now. I didn't pull you out of that creek just to watch you slip away in a warm bed." Clara's eyes fluttered open, focusing on him with difficulty. She saw a rugged face, wind-burned and honest, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and gray eyes that held genuine concern. He was handsome in that raw, unpolished way of men who made their living under the open sky. "Thank you," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. The relief that flooded through Ethan at hearing her speak was almost overwhelming. "You are going to be fine," he promised, and he meant it with everything in him. "Just stay awake for me. Stay here." Margaret came in with heated stones wrapped in cloth and hot broth in a cup. Between the two of them, they managed to get Clara sitting up enough to take small sips of the salty liquid. With each swallow, a little more awareness returned to her eyes. As the hours passed and the immediate danger lessened, Margaret finally shooed Ethan out of the room so she could properly tend to Clara in privacy. Ethan waited in the main room, pacing like a caged animal, jumping every time he heard a sound from the bedroom. Thomas Henderson, Margaret's husband, arrived home to find Ethan wearing a path in his floor. After Margaret filled him in on what had happened, Thomas clapped Ethan on the shoulder with genuine admiration. "You saved that girl's life," Thomas said. "That took quick thinking and braver action than most men could manage." Ethan just shook his head. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Thomas corrected. "They wouldn't have. Most men would have been too worried about the ice giving way under them too. You risked your own life without hesitation." 3 days passed before Clara was well enough to sit up without assistance and speak without her voice shaking from lingering weakness. Margaret had tended to her with maternal care, bringing her hot meals and warm drinks, sitting with her when the nightmares of dark water and suffocating ice jolted her awake. Ethan came by every day, ostensibly to check on Copper, who was being stabled at the Henderson ranch, but everyone knew the real reason. He would sit in the main room, hat in his hands, asking after Clara's condition with barely concealed anxiety. On the 4th day, Margaret finally allowed him to visit Clara in her room, leaving the door open for propriety's sake. Ethan approached the doorway almost shyly, this man who had fearlessly crawled across breaking ice now hesitant to enter a simple bedroom. Clara was sitting up in bed, her honey-colored hair loose around her shoulders and her cheeks finally holding healthy color again. She smiled when she saw him, and something in Ethan's chest tightened at the sight. "They tell me you have been asking after me," Clara said, her voice still a little rough but stronger than it had been. Ethan stepped into the room, maintaining a respectful distance. "I needed to know you were recovering. I needed to know it was not all for nothing." "It was not," Clara assured him. "Thanks to you, I am alive. I owe you everything." "You do not owe me anything," Ethan said firmly. "I am just glad I was there, that I heard the ice crack." They looked at each other for a long moment, and something unspoken passed between them. It was the recognition of a connection forged in crisis, yes, but also something deeper. Something that had nothing to do with rescue and everything to do with the way Clara's smile made Ethan's heart race, or the way Clara felt safe for the first time in years when she looked at him. "Will you sit?" Clara asked, gesturing to the chair beside the bed. "I would like to know more about the man who saved my life." Ethan sat, and they talked. They talked as the afternoon light slanted through the window, as it faded into evening, as Margaret brought them both supper on trays. Clara learned that Ethan had come to Texas from Missouri 5 years earlier, following the promise of work and a fresh start after his parents had died. He had worked his way up from stable hand to foreman through sheer determination and honest labor. Ethan learned that Clara had come to Alpine 2 years ago from Louisiana, fleeing a family situation she didn't elaborate on, but which had clearly left scars. She worked as a cook at the Henderson Ranch and saved every penny she could, dreaming of one day opening a small restaurant in town. "I make an excellent gumbo," Clara said with a small smile. "Seems Alpine could use a little Louisiana flavor." "I would stand in line for that," Ethan said, and was rewarded with Clara's laugh. The days turned into a week, and Clara grew stronger. She began taking short walks around the Henderson house, wrapped in shawls and watched over carefully by Margaret. Ethan continued to visit daily, and their conversations grew longer and more personal. They discovered shared tastes in literature, both loving the adventure novels that made their way west. They both loved horses and the wide open spaces of Texas. They both harbored dreams bigger than their current circumstances. On the 10th day after the accident, Dr. Morrison from town finally made it out to the ranch, the roads having been impassable due to the unusual weather. He examined Clara thoroughly and pronounced her fully recovered, though he cautioned her to take care and avoid any more ice for the foreseeable future. That evening, as Clara sat in the main room with the Hendersons and Ethan, Margaret broached the subject they had all been avoiding. "You are welcome to stay as long as you need," Margaret said to Clara, "but I expect you will want to get back to your own place in town eventually." Clara nodded slowly. She rented a small room above the general store, a modest space but her own. "I should return soon. I have already imposed on your kindness far too long." "You have not imposed at all," Thomas assured her. "You are always welcome here. But if you are going back to town, someone should accompany you. Those roads are still treacherous." "I will take her," Ethan said immediately. "Tomorrow, if she feels ready." Clara met his eyes and nodded. Tomorrow would be fine. That night, lying in the guest bed, Clara stared at the ceiling and tried to understand the tumult of feelings inside her. She had spent 2 years in Alpine carefully avoiding any romantic entanglements. The reason she had fled Louisiana, though she hadn't told Ethan the full story, was a man. Her father had arranged a marriage to a wealthy plantation owner, a man 3 times her age with a reputation for cruelty. Clara had refused, and when her father had tried to force the issue, she had run. She had sworn to herself that she would never let her life be dictated by a man again. She would make her own way, build her own future, and answer to no one but herself. But Ethan was different. He didn't try to command or control. He listened when she spoke. He respected her opinions. When he looked at her, she didn't see ownership or possession in his eyes. She saw genuine interest, respect, and something tender that made her heart race. She was falling for him, and the realization terrified her. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Ethan brought Copper and a gentle mare named Daisy for Clara to ride. Margaret packed them food for the journey and extra blankets, fussing over them like a mother hen, until Thomas gently reminded her that Alpine was only an hour's ride away. Clara hugged Margaret tightly. "Thank you for everything. You saved my life just as much as Ethan did." "You take care of yourself," Margaret said, holding Clara at arm's length and looking her in the eye. "And you hold onto that young man. Good ones are rare as hen's teeth out here." The ride into Alpine was quiet at first, both Clara and Ethan lost in their own thoughts. The landscape was still touched with winter's hand, but the extreme cold had finally broken. Water dripped from icicles, and the snow was turning soft and wet underfoot. "I have been thinking," Ethan said finally, breaking the comfortable silence, "about what you said about opening a restaurant." Clara glanced at him curiously. "What about it?" "There is a building on Main Street, been empty for near 2 years now. Used to be a law office before the lawyer moved to Fort Worth. The owner has been trying to rent it out, but no one seems to want it. I think it would make a good restaurant. Big windows facing the street, good location near the hotel." Clara's heart began to beat faster. "I have saved some money, but not enough for rent and supplies both." "What if you had a partner?" Ethan asked, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Someone who could help with the initial costs, maybe help with the building work that needs doing." "Ethan, I could not ask you to risk your savings on my dream." "You are not asking. I am offering." He finally turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gray eyes took her breath away. "Clara, these past 10 days, getting to know you, have been the best days I have had in Texas. Maybe the best days I have had anywhere. I know it is fast. I know we just met under the most unusual circumstances, but I cannot imagine not having you in my life now." Clara pulled Daisy to a halt, and Ethan stopped Copper beside her. They sat there in the middle of the road, horses steaming in the cold air, and looked at each other. "I am scared," Clara admitted. "I have very good reasons to be wary of depending on any man." "I am not asking you to depend on me," Ethan said carefully. "I am asking if we can depend on each other, partners in business and maybe, if you are willing, in life." "You want to court me," Clara said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I want to court you," Ethan confirmed. "Properly, with all the time you need to feel certain. I will not rush you, I will not pressure you, and I will never, ever try to control you. You have my word on that." Clara studied his face, searching for any hint of deception or ulterior motive. She found none. What she found instead was honesty, hope, and a vulnerability that matched her own. "I would like that," she said softly. "The courting and the partnership. Both." The smile that broke across Ethan's face was like sunrise, and Clara found herself smiling back just as widely. They continued into Alpine with new energy, making plans and dreaming out loud. Ethan took Clara to see the empty building on Main Street, and despite its current state of disrepair, Clara could see the potential. The space was good, the location perfect, and the owner, when they tracked him down at the bank, seemed almost pathetically grateful for their interest. "Been empty too long," Mr. Peterson said, the portly banker mopping his brow despite the cold. "I will give you favorable terms, very favorable. Alpine needs more businesses, more life. A restaurant would be just the thing." Over the next weeks, Clara and Ethan threw themselves into the work of transforming the space. Ethan proved to be skilled with his hands, repairing the warped floorboards and the broken window frames. Clara cleaned and painted and planned her menu with meticulous care. The whole town seemed to take interest in the project, with people stopping by to offer advice, help, or just to see how things were progressing. During this time, Ethan courted Clara with a steadfastness that gradually wore down her walls. He brought her flowers, wildflowers he picked himself on his rides between the Double R Ranch and town. He took her on picnics when the weather warmed. He read to her in the evenings, sitting in the parlor of Mrs. Donnelly's boarding house, where Clara had moved after leaving her room above the general store. Mrs. Donnelly, a widow in her 60s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, watched the courtship with approval. "That one is a keeper," she told Clara more than once. "Got a good head on his shoulders and kindness in his heart. Rare combination." Clara could not disagree. With each passing day, she found herself falling deeper in love with Ethan Vaughn. She loved the way he listened to her ideas without dismissing them. She loved how he never tried to take over the restaurant project, but instead supported her vision while offering his own thoughts when asked. She loved his laugh, his work ethic, and the gentle way he treated animals and people alike. 3 months after the ice had broken beneath her feet, Clara's restaurant opened its doors. She had named it the Creek House, both as a reminder of how close she had come to death, and as a celebration of the life she had been given back. The name raised some eyebrows, but once people tasted Clara's cooking, all questions ceased. Her Louisiana gumbo became famous in Alpine practically overnight. She also served more traditional fare, steaks and beans and cornbread, but it was her Creole specialties that had people coming from surrounding ranches and even other towns. The restaurant thrived beyond her wildest dreams. Ethan had quit his job as foreman at the Double R Ranch and now worked as Clara's business partner, managing the books and the supply orders while also helping in the kitchen when things got busy. They worked side by side 12 hours a day, and instead of growing tired of each other, they only grew closer. On a warm evening in May, 6 months after he had pulled her from the frozen creek, Ethan closed the restaurant early and led Clara outside. The sun was setting, painting the Texas sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. "Where are we going?" Clara asked, laughing as Ethan took her hand and led her down Main Street. "You will see." He brought her to the edge of town, to a small rise that overlooked Alpine and the surrounding landscape. The view was breathtaking, miles of open land stretching toward distant mountains. "I bought it," Ethan said, gesturing to the land around them. 5 acres. "It is not much, but it is enough for a house. A good house, with room for a family." Clara's breath caught. She turned to look at Ethan and found him down on one knee, a simple gold band held in his work-roughened fingers. "Clara Whitmore, you are the bravest, most determined, most fascinating woman I have ever known. You have made these last 6 months the happiest of my life. I love you with everything I am, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you every single day. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Clara's face, but she was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Ethan, I will marry you." He stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around as she laughed and cried at the same time. When he finally set her down, he slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her for the first time, a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. They were married in August in a simple ceremony at the Alpine Church. Margaret and Thomas Henderson stood up for them, and it seemed like the whole town turned out for the celebration afterward at the Creek House. Clara wore a dress of pale blue silk that Margaret had helped her sew, and Ethan wore his best suit, borrowed from the general store owner who was roughly his size. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Clara rested her head against Ethan's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. This man had saved her life, yes, but more than that, he had helped her build a new one. He had shown her that not all men sought to control or diminish. Some, the rare and precious ones, sought only to stand beside you as you reached for your dreams. "What are you thinking?" Ethan murmured against her hair. "That I am the luckiest woman alive," Clara answered honestly. "That creek tried to kill me, but instead it brought me to you." Strange how something so terrifying could lead to something so beautiful. "Life is like that sometimes," Ethan said. "The darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures if we are brave enough to keep going." They built their house on the land Ethan had bought, working on it together on Sundays when the restaurant was closed. It took nearly a year, but when it was finished, it was exactly what they had both dreamed of. A 2-story frame house with a wide porch, windows that caught the morning light, and enough bedrooms for the family they both hoped to have. The Creek House restaurant continued to thrive. Clara hired help, so she would not have to work such long hours, training 2 young women from town in her cooking methods and gradually teaching them her recipes. This gave her more time to spend at home with Ethan, building their life together. In the spring of 1886, 2 years after Ethan had pulled Clara from the frozen creek, their first child was born. A son, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's honey-colored hair. They named him Thomas, after Thomas Henderson, who had shown them both such kindness. Clara discovered that motherhood came naturally to her, perhaps because she was so determined to be different from her own parents. She showered little Thomas with love and affection, while also teaching him independence and strength of character. Ethan was a devoted father, coming home from the restaurant every day at noon to spend time with his son, reading to him and playing with him, and simply reveling in the miracle of this life they had created. When Thomas was 2, Clara gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Margaret in honor of the woman who had nursed Clara back to health. Margaret Vaughn had her mother's determination from the start, entering the world with a lusty cry that announced her intention to be heard. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. The Creek House became an institution in Alpine, the place where ranchers and townspeople alike gathered for good food and good company. Clara's reputation as a chef spread far beyond Alpine, and she began to train other young women who wanted to learn the culinary arts, passing on her knowledge with the same generosity that had been shown to her. Ethan proved to have a gift for business, expanding their enterprise carefully and thoughtfully. By 1890, they had opened a second restaurant in Fort Stockton, managed by one of Clara's best students, and were considering a third in Marfa. But for all their business success, it was their family life that brought them the most joy. Thomas grew into a thoughtful, kind boy who loved horses and books in equal measure. Margaret was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, always asking questions and exploring everything around her. In 1889, they welcomed a third child, another son they named Ethan Jr., though everyone called him E.J. on a cold January evening in 1894, exactly 10 years after Clara had fallen through the ice. The Vaughn family gathered on their porch to watch the sunset. Thomas was 9, Margaret was 7, and E.J. was 4. Clara sat in her rocking chair with E.J. on her lap, while Ethan stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders. Thomas and Margaret sat on the porch steps, arguing good-naturedly about something that had happened at school. "Do you ever think about that day?" Ethan asked quietly, leaning down so only Clara could hear. "About the ice." "Every January," Clara admitted. "How could I not? It changed everything." "Do you ever regret it? The path it set us on?" Clara reached up and covered his hand with hers. "Not for a single moment. That frozen creek took everything I thought I knew about my life and shattered it just like the ice. But what rose from that cold water was so much better than anything I could have planned for myself." "I love you," Ethan said, words he spoke every day but which never lost their meaning. "I love you too," Clara replied. "My rescuer, my partner, my heart." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in brilliant colors, Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here. From Louisiana to Alpine, from a terrified girl running from an arranged marriage to a woman who had built a life on her own terms. From drowning under the ice to being pulled up into air and light and love. The winter of 1884 had been unusually cold, turning the Texas landscape into something strange and dangerous. But it had also been the winter she met Ethan Vaughn, the cowboy who hadn't hesitated to risk his own life for a stranger. The man who had become her partner, her husband, the father of her children, and the love of her life. Some people believed in fate, that everything happened for a reason. Clara wasn't sure about that, but she did believe in choices. Ethan had chosen to race toward danger instead of away from it. She had chosen to trust him despite her fears. And together, they had chosen to build something beautiful and lasting. Their restaurant fed the people of Alpine and beyond. Their children would grow up knowing they were loved and valued. And their love story, born from ice and cold water and desperate rescue, would endure for all their days. On weekends, the whole family often went riding together, exploring the land around Alpine. They always avoided Timber Creek in winter, but in summer it was a favorite spot for picnics. The children would wade in the shallow water while Clara and Ethan watched from the bank, holding hands and remembering. Thomas, as he grew older, loved to hear the story of how his parents met. He would beg them to tell it again and again, and each time his eyes would grow wide at the part where his father crawled across the breaking ice. "You were so brave, Papa," Thomas would say with admiration shining in his young face. "I was terrified," Ethan would correct gently. "But sometimes being brave means acting even when you are scared. Your mother was the brave one, fighting to stay alive under that ice." Margaret, practical even at a young age, always wanted to know the logistics. How thick was the ice? How long could someone survive in water that cold? How did they get Clara warm again? She absorbed every detail with the intensity of someone planning to use the information someday. Edge, the youngest, just liked being included in the family storytelling, even if he didn't fully understand yet what had happened before he was born. As the children grew, so did the business. By 1895, the Vaughns owned 3 successful restaurants across West Texas, but Clara and Ethan were careful never to let work consume their lives the way it consumed so many others. They remembered too well the preciousness of life, how quickly it could be snatched away by a crack in the ice or 1,000 other dangers. They made time for each other, for their children, for the simple pleasures of watching a sunset or reading a good book, or sitting together in comfortable silence at the end of a long day. They built traditions, like Sunday dinners where the whole family gathered no matter what, and annual trips to visit the Hendersons, who had become like grandparents to their children. Thomas Henderson passed away in 1893, but Margaret Henderson remained a vital presence in their lives, coming to stay with them for months at a time and doting on the children who bore her name and her husband's. She would sit on the porch with Clara and shake her head in wonder at how things had turned out. "To think," Margaret would say, "all this came from that terrible day when Ethan came racing up to my house with you half frozen in his arms. God works in mysterious ways." Clara would nod, though her views on divine intervention were complicated. She preferred to think that people worked in mysterious ways, that human kindness and bravery and love were the real miracles. Ethan had chosen to be a miracle that day on the ice. Everything else had flowed from that choice. In 1896, when Thomas was 12, he asked if he could learn to work in the restaurant kitchen. Clara was delighted to teach him, and discovered that her eldest son had inherited her talent for cooking. Margaret, at 10, declared that she wanted to learn the business side of things, like her father. And Edge, at 7, announced that he wanted to be a cowboy like his papa had been. "You can be anything you want to be," Ethan told each of his children. "Your mother and I will support you no matter what path you choose." It was a radical statement for the time, especially regarding Margaret. Most people assumed that girls should learn domestic skills and prepare for marriage, nothing more. But the Vaughns had never been conventional. They raised their daughter to believe she could do anything her brothers could do, and their sons to respect that truth. In 1898, as the century drew toward its close, Clara and Ethan made a decision. They had been blessed with success beyond their dreams, but they wanted to share that blessing. They began offering apprenticeships at their restaurants to young people who couldn't afford culinary training otherwise. They hired people other establishments turned away, including Mexican immigrants facing discrimination and women seeking independence. The Creek House in Alpine became known not just for its excellent food, but for its progressive hiring practices and its owner's generosity. When criticism came, as it inevitably did, Ethan and Clara faced it together with the same partnership that had built their business in the first place. "We were both given chances when we needed them most," Clara would say to anyone who questioned their choices. "We are simply passing that kindness forward." The turn of the century found the Vaughn family thriving. Thomas, at 16, was talking about opening his own restaurant someday, maybe in San Antonio or Austin. Margaret, at 14, had a head for numbers that put most accountants to shame, and was already helping manage the books for all 3 restaurants. Edge, at 11, spent every spare moment at the Double R Ranch, learning horsemanship and cattle work from the cowboys there. Clara and Ethan, now in their early 40s, looked at their children with pride and wonder. These 3 remarkable young people were the legacy of that frozen January day in 1884, the ripples spreading out from a moment of crisis and rescue. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1898, Ethan took Clara back to the spot where he had proposed, the little rise overlooking Alpine. The town had grown considerably in the intervening years, spreading out across the landscape with new buildings and new families. But the view still took Clara's breath away. 20 years, Ethan said, his arm around her waist. Sometimes it feels like 20 minutes, and sometimes it feels like we have been together forever. Both can be true, Clara said, leaning into his warmth. Every day with you feels both brand new and completely familiar. If you could go back, Ethan asked, to that day on the ice, knowing everything that would come from it, would you change anything? Clara was quiet for a moment, really considering the question. That day had been terrifying, painful, and had left her with lingering nightmares for years. But it had also been the first day of her real life, the day everything changed for the better. "Not a single thing," she said finally. "Every moment of fear, every second of cold, every doubt and struggle that came after, it all led us here. To this life, these children, this love. I wouldn't change any of it." Ethan kissed her then, a kiss that held 20 years of partnership and passion and profound friendship. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "Here is to 20 more," Ethan said. "At least," Clara agreed. They would get more than 20 more. They would get 35 more years together, watching their children grow and marry and have children of their own. They would see the restaurants continue to thrive even as the West changed around them, becoming less wild and more civilized. They would see automobiles replace horses, electricity come to Alpine, and the world transform in ways they never could have imagined. But through all the changes, one thing remained constant: the love between Clara and Ethan Vaughn, forged in ice and water and desperate rescue, strengthened by shared dreams and hard work, and deepened by decades of choosing each other every single day. When Clara passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1933 at the age of 72, Ethan was holding her hand. Their children, all successful and happy in their own lives, gathered to mourn and remember. Thomas, now running a chain of restaurants across Texas, told stories of learning to cook at his mother's side. Margaret, who had become one of the first female business owners in Alpine, spoke of her mother's courage and independence. Edge, who managed a successful horse ranch, talked about his mother's kindness and strength. Ethan listened to his children celebrate their mother's life, his heart both breaking and full. Clara had been his partner for 49 years, his best friend and greatest love. Life without her seemed impossible to contemplate. But he had 6 months more, 6 months in which his children and grandchildren surrounded him with love and care. He spent that time telling stories, making sure the younger generation knew where they came from and what their grandmother had overcome. She was drowning under the ice, he would tell his grandchildren, their eyes wide with attention. And I broke through and pulled her up into the air. But the truth is, she saved me just as much as I saved her. She gave me purpose, partnership, and a love that sustained me through every day of my life. When Ethan joined Clara in the Alpine Cemetery in the spring of 1934, his children buried him beside her under a shared headstone that read, "Clara and Ethan Vaughn, partners in life, love, and legacy. 1884 forever." The Creek House restaurant continued for 2 more generations, run first by Thomas and then by his daughter Caroline. It became a landmark in Alpine, a piece of living history that locals were proud to show off to visitors. The story of its founding, of the woman who nearly drowned and the cowboy who saved her, became part of Alpine's folklore. And every January, the Vaughn family would gather at the cemetery to remember. They would place flowers on the graves of Clara and Ethan, and they would tell the story again to the newest generation. The story of how love can come from the most unexpected places, how courage in a single moment can change countless lives, and how 2 people who chose each other, despite fear and uncertainty, built something that would outlast them both. The frozen creek that nearly claimed Clara's life had instead given her everything worth living for. And the cowboy who broke through the ice found that in saving her, he had found his own salvation. Together, they proved that sometimes the coldest moments can lead to the warmest futures, and that true love, once found, endures forever.